Okay, hi everybody. This is going to be our first flipped video. As you saw in the last video, I talked about more how it was going to work, and I showed you a little bit about how we're going to take our notes. I just want to remind you that right now you should set up your paper in that method. Draw a line at the top, put our title. Title today is the political spectrum. Have your Q column, where you'll put your main ideas and your essential questions, and then remember this is the part of the paper where we're going to take our notes, leaving space at the bottom for the summary. So go ahead and set up your paper now. Alright, so as we're moving on to our second unit of study, we've talked a little bit about the different political jargon terms there are, so that when you're reading a newspaper or listening to a broadcast, you'll be able to pick up on some of those words. Well, now we're going to focus on the difference in political ideas. How does someone know that they're a Democrat? How does someone vote for a Republican? Where does that all come from, and where on the spectrum is that going to fall? So that's what we're going to start with, the political spectrum. Just as in science, you have acids and bases. You have some things that you can touch with your hand and it won't hurt, whereas if you go to a strong acid or a strong base, if you were to pour that hydrochloric acid on your hand, what would happen? Ouch, right? The same thing is going to apply for the political spectrum. In the center, you're going to have people who, oh, sometimes I feel this way and sometimes I feel that way. But if you go to those outer edges, you're going to have that more extreme. So that's what we're going to do. When you talk politics, we just started political jargon. Well, there's more jargon to come, all right? Right and left. Maybe you've heard someone say, I lean to the right, I lean to the left, or he's far right and she's far left. Well, those are political jargon terms. This is the spectrum. Starting on the far left, you have revolutionary. Then it goes to liberal, then moderate, conservative, and reactionary. If you notice, I didn't say the word Republican, or I haven't said the word Democrat. You may have heard me reference a conservative or a liberal or even a moderate in class. That's because those are the places along the political spectrum. You have those 5 places, and then there are examples of a Democrat or a Green Party underneath that. Now, there are only 5 places on the spectrum. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be pegged in one of those. Imagine that there are lots of little lines all over that spectrum, and that you don't have to say, I am only a conservative and I can never see the liberal view, or I am only a liberal and I could never be a moderate. All right, so we want to take a look and see where does everyone in the United States fall somewhere along this spectrum. Now, as I said, the sides are going to be the extremes. So take revolutionary. Some examples of revolutionary would be Sons of Liberty. You might remember that from 1776. Or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the Irish Republican Army, right? All of these were revolutionary groups. Talk about they had to use violence. The revolution fought in the Revolutionary War. They had to overthrow the government in order to see the change that they wanted. As we progress along the political spectrum, you see that we're moving on to liberal. Now, the examples that we have for liberal are going to be a Democrat or a Green Party. So you can see that if you're a Democrat, then you're going to be a liberal. But just because you're a liberal, it doesn't necessarily make you a Democrat. Next, you have moderate. A moderate is a very interesting place on the spectrum because there are not specific characteristics for someone who's a moderate. It all depends on what the issue is. Money towards the military? I think we should have some. What about gay rights? I might feel this way. They're going to take a look at each issue and make their decision based on that. This group, the moderates and the independents, these are who the candidates are vying for right now. These are going to be the people who decide who the next president is going to be, because most of the time conservatives are going to vote Republican and liberals are going to vote for the Democrat. So that helps us move right along the spectrum. And now we're at conservatives. Some examples of conservatives would be a Republican or a Tea Partier. So once again, you see that conservative is sort of this umbrella for a couple of these other political parties. Lastly, you have a reactionary. Notice the groups that are on here: KKK, neo-Nazi, the Taliban. These people believe in slow change, so slow that you want to almost go backwards. All right, and we say back to the good old days. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So when you had this original spectrum, this left to right spectrum, it really focused on the rate of change that the government, that you wanted to see in your government. The liberals wanted progression. We need to change. We need to expand rights. We need to continue to change with the times. Whereas if the conservatives would say, no, we don't. We need to focus more on tradition, traditional values, usually too Christian values. Not always, but traditional Christian values would be what drive them. So you had this left to right rate of change. Liberal is often talked to and sometimes referred to as a progressive, so you might see those two words changed, used interchangeably. Sometimes people will use the word progressive when they don't want to be pigeonholed as that liberal, all right? And then sometimes when we have the right, we hear that concept of return to the good old days. The radicals, so either side, you've got R, and R. So you know that both the reactionary and the revolutionary, they're both very radical. Just like I said, you pour that hydrochloric acid on your hand, you're going to burn it. The same is going to be for these two groups. Think about what the examples. KKK, neo-Nazi, Taliban. What do they all have in common? They all use violence. Palestinian Liberation Organization, Irish Republican Army, Sons of Liberty, all use violence. So that's important to know, that those two sides all the way on the extreme are going to use violence to get their point across. However, the majority of Americans are not going to use violence to get their point across. In fact, when you have that political spectrum and you have those 5 places, liberal and conservative, with moderate being in the middle, depending on the issue, is where the majority of United States citizens are going to fall. So that's what we want to do, is take a look and break down, well, what does it mean to be a liberal? What are some of the characteristics that a liberal might have? All right, like we said before, they're progressive. They're someone who wants change, change with the times. If you're a liberal, then you're going to want to give money to social programs. A social program could be Social Security, welfare, Medicare, Medicaid, right? That's where you really want to see the money going. And you say, it's okay that my taxes are going up because I know that it's going to a good cause. You don't want diplomacy over military action. Hopefully we can talk it out. We'll send our Secretary of State to discuss something instead of sending in the tanks. Now, just because you say that war is not the answer doesn't mean that you're definitely always going to be a liberal. If you're a liberal, you are going to focus on gay rights. You would support gay marriage, animal rights. To be pro-choice, you believe that it's the woman's right to choose whether or not she could have an abortion. Now, this is a little tricky because some people believe for themselves, well, I don't want to have an abortion, but pro-choice is saying it's more the woman's right to choose what she would do. You'd be against the death penalty. You would favor gun control. Now that's a tricky one because you say favor guns, but it's favoring the control of guns. So we just had those attacks at the Dark Knight Rises premiere, that a liberal might come out and say, listen, this is an example of a time that we should maybe restrict assault weapons or high round machines, guns that shoot a lot of bullets. All right? And then lastly, they favor government regulations. That means that, okay, we think that there might be some corruption on Wall Street, or there might be some loopholes that people are trying to, finagle their way through. They would say the government should be the one to step in. So that's the general characteristics. But remember, you don't necessarily have to fit on one side or the other. All right? Now, what about a conservative? Strong military. All right? Conservative, so you're thinking about your Republican presidents, they would want to build up the military. Ronald Reagan, key president for doing that. If you're a conservative, then you're going to say pro-business. All right? Look at the presidential debates that we've seen. Mitt Romney saying, we have to give the money to the businesses and then let the businesses stimulate the economy, and they can be the ones to hire more people, as opposed to a liberal who might say, well, it's the government's job to do that. Right? If you're a conservative, those traditional family values, you would be pro-life. There's not a time when there should ever be an abortion. I think you've heard about that in the news recently. In favor of the Second Amendment. Second Amendment is the right to carry a gun. Right? And they say that no gun control, that cannot be taken away ever, because that's one of the reasons of how we gained our independence. Next one, supporting traditional marriages, saying that a marriage is between a man and a woman. And lastly, strong states' rights. We talked about in class Mitt Romney's healthcare program of Massachusetts being the model for Obama's, and how he could seem, as he's contradicting himself, however, he said it should be a state-by-state decision. So that's the perfect example of seeing how states should be more powerful, or not more powerful, but they should have equal power to the federal government. So these are liberal and conservative, the two largest places on the political spectrum. And remember that moderate position in the middle, well, they take a look at it. Well, sometimes I like limited government regulation, but I'm pro-choice. So you have to look at which side. That was the original political spectrum. What's the problem with that? We don't all fit somewhere along that line from left to right. Instead, you had to add this up and down, and this is what some political scientists are now calling the political compass. So the political spectrum was that original left to right, but now we have a compass. You have up and down as well. And so you see the word authoritarian here. What word do you see in that? You see the word authority. At the bottom, libertarian. What word do you see? You see the word liberty, okay? So they had to add this other piece of the political spectrum to make a compass, to say that an authoritarian is going to say that the government should have a larger role. So we always talk that liberal and conservative comes down to the size of the government. Well, not always. We're going to use some new terminology, authoritarian and libertarian. So that authoritarian, a larger authority. If there is an issue that arises, that it should be the government to step in and fix that problem. Whereas libertarian, those personal liberties, rights, freedoms, those are more important, and that the government shouldn't be as large, and the government shouldn't be regulating businesses. The people should be left to run the country the way they see fit. Okay, so those are our notes for today. You can always pause, you can always rewind, repeat as many times as you want in case you missed something on here. This is our first time taking the notes, so Mrs. Cowan is going to go through and show you what your notes should look like. Remember, this is a pilot, this is a work in progress. The whole purpose of this is that you could very well have questions, and we want you to have questions. Questions about this, questions about learning more. So make sure that you bring those to class so that we can have these great discussions as the purpose of this video. So I'm going to pass it off to Mrs. Cowan now.
All right. We are going to have to move over here to the smartboard. Can we see that, Mrs. Lacey? Might be a little rough, huh?
We'll just go
Get a little closer. Okay, we're going to go step by step. So as Mrs. Lacey said, this is over the political spectrum. So up here on the top of our Cornell notes, we have our title, which is political spectrum. And then we drew a line over here. We're using that red line on our notebook paper to separate our Q column from our notes section. So the first thing that Mrs. Lacey went over was the political spectrum. So since that is a main idea or a key term, we're going to put that over on the left in our Q column. Then we're going to copy that political spectrum that she had on her whiteboard. Now it might be a really good idea to stop and pause. That's the beauty of this. You can stop and pause her lecture and fill everything in. Now if you can't see it on her board because the computer or the video is not as clear, you can always use what you hear. And if this doesn't make sense, you can add in even more information as she's speaking. So then as we go down the board, let's see if we can get it to go down. The next term was Democrats. We went ahead and listed all of that information over here. Now notice in the Q column we have all of this empty space, but that's because this was all of the information that related to the idea of a Democrat, the main idea. Then we're going down to the Republican information. Listed everything that she discussed, and if I don't understand something, maybe I need to add on to some of these words if I don't quite understand them. And then there's a picture of the political compass. Oh boy, there we go. Read along here. Now if you notice, down here in the bottom, we drew a line after the end of our notes. This is where I'm going to write in any of those questions that came along. Since we're not in a classroom, while Mrs. Lacey is going over this, you can't raise your hand and ask a question if you don't understand something. This is your opportunity to write those questions, comments, ideas down here. Let us know if you have any more questions. I hope it went well. Good luck, and we'll see you tomorrow.